saw the Russians running among the rubble.
He positioned the rifle. His finger was on the trigger, ready to hit each one. That soldier had been fighting against the Russians in that direction for a few months. His brigade was there for direct attacks and to take back what Moscow had conquered. Among his enemies was a battalion made up of soccer fanatics. They were even more than that. There were experienced soldiers among them who fought in the Chechen War. There were trained drone pilots and also snipers. There were also some among them with criminal ideologies who turned part of their fame as warriors into infamy. This story involves men, situations, and extreme ideologies. There are images and photos of individuals associated with organizations or schools of thought that follow Nazism or similar ideologies. Remember the crimes committed by the Nazis. Remember what they thought and how they treated certain individuals. Never forget this as you face the history ahead. But also keep in mind that individuals or small groups will be shown here. Don't be foolish enough to generalize and instantly turn an entire population into Nazis, criminals, or supremacists. They had been there since the armed conflicts began in Ukraine in 2014, but only later were they named Espanola and later the 88th Espanola Brigade.
Władysław Potupiev.
There would be a lot of stories to tell about this battalion, made up of diverse individuals, some of whom have at least questionable ideologies. Not to say worse. At this moment, however, there is an unquestionable diversity of values and individuals within the battalion, evoking the madness of soccer fanatics and channeling their energy into the war. The identification of Espanola with soccer teams definitely started with Stanislav Orlov, a Central Sports Club of the Army fan. In 1995, he became part of the Red Blue Warriors, one of the oldest supporter groups of the team that Orlov dominated. 4 years later, the soccer fields left his side so he could focus only on the battlefields of Chechnya. It was 1999 and he was in one of the major wars that Russia faced after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. In August 1999, Islamic extremists invaded the Dagestan region in Russia. Shortly after, in September, a series of explosions in residential buildings shook Russian cities, leaving more than 300 dead. Russian authorities immediately accused Chechen groups of the attacks, although no leader or guerrilla commander claimed responsibility here. Many questioned the incident, claiming it was a false flag, with some saying it was orchestrated by Russia itself, or that Islamic extremists with no connection to Chechnya were the ones who did it. In the first clashes, Russian military forces, along with allied Chechen militias, faced the separatists in direct battles. The powerful army sent by Moscow had already been forced into a truce 3 years earlier. After regrouping and gaining support among Chechen traitors, the Russians returned. Among these reinforcements was Stanislav Yonov, then in the 106th Airborne Division.
It wasn't easy for the Russians, not at many moments.
Their BMPs approached, trying to attack the troops, but was stopped by successive rocket-propelled grenade shots. The crew and the soldiers were forced to surrender. The Chechens intended to take them, but one of the Moscow soldiers who was hiding decided to shoot. Amid the smoke storm, the Russian died. Even so, the T-72S rolled over Chechen soil. Wherever the Russians passed, there were ruins. The capital, Grozny, was turned into a symbol of death. After a long siege during the winter, which lasted from December 1999 to February 2000, pro-Russian troops managed to take full control of the Chechen capital. Orlov survived. The forge of war strengthened the steel of the soul and sharpened the blade of the fighting spirit. In 2014, at 33, and reportedly using the codename Espanyol, he traveled to Donetsk to fight against the Ukrainians. His motivation, in his own words, was to defend his relatives in the city of Iznesnoy. He also said that one of his relatives had died due to a Ukrainian bombing in the city of Gorlovka. The hostilities had already begun when Orlov arrived. His soul, forged in war, made him rise quickly through the ranks. And in 2015, he was the leader of the Skull and Bones Reconnaissance Company. At that time, he came into contact with Alexander Khodakovsky, the commander of the Vostok Formation, a group that would help nurture the beginnings of the Spaniard. He left Donbass in 2016 after the battles subsided. He left the war, but it stayed with him. Rumor has it that the spirit of battle, Orlov's loyal ally, needed to keep cutting. The Spaniard's shadow was reported in Montenegro after his arrival on September 30, 2016. The Montenegrin prosecutor's office stated that the terrorist planned to assassinate the prime minister on October 16 of the same year. The plan failed, and the Montenegrins accused the Russians of planning everything. The complexity of the operation suggested a connection with the main intelligence directorate, the Russian military intelligence responsible for missions of this kind. Orlov's name resurfaced strongly, not as a shadow or through rumors, when he began recruiting soccer fans at the start of the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The Spaniard started at that moment. Still under the auspices of the Vostok Battalion, the soccer fanatics began their first battles. In the wave of combat in Mariupol, the Russians marched against Mariupol at the beginning of the war. The siege was already in place on February 24, 2022. Asida, Russian tanks opened fire on the Ukrainian troops defending the city. The shots shattered Mariupol's structure. There, at the beginning of the war, Russia began to show its power to turn cities into ruins. The Ukrainians defended themselves. Their armored vehicles encountered one. The shots hit the Russian armor. Battle. The Azov Battalion launched their mortars at the enemy columns. The explosions of the armored vehicles and the burning flesh of the Russians made the soldiers from Moscow even more enraged. Azov was one of Russia's symbols for the invasion of Ukraine. It was no wonder. It was one of the key forces in retaking Mariupol years earlier. In addition, the presence of Nazi elements and the war crimes committed at that time served perfectly for the Russians as a banner for the war. Exaggerating Azov's influence by turning it into a Nazi monster that created the oppressive regime in Kyiv and hunted Russians who only wanted to save the world. The soldiers of Espanola were there. They took part in the siege of the city, one of the strategic points in the fight for Donbass. His men walked through the destroyed city, witnessing one of the key moments in the history of the conflict in Ukraine. The pressure was intense, surrounding the Azov Battalion, the last source of resistance in the Azovstal steel complex. The battle for Mariupol ended in May 2022 with the surrender of these last forces. El Espanola left his mark on Mariupol. Some of his men even stayed in the destroyed city, a place where at least 25,000 civilians were estimated to have died. One of these figures was the American Ted Boy Gregg, a barber who went to Russia. According to him, he wanted to live a conservative life, far from the liberal values of the West. saying he had a Russian soul. He also claimed to have received an award for his contribution or victory over Ukrainian Nazism. Before going to Russia, Ted was part of the Hammerskins, a white supremacist group formed in 1988 in Dallas, Texas. The Hammerskins were affiliated with the record label 9% Productions. They idolized those they considered historical warriors for the Aryan race, such as the Vikings and the Nazis. These absurdities were part of Ted's beliefs. It's no wonder that, in one of his posts, the American stated that he was fighting for Russia to ensure he would have white children. He became one of the points for gathering supplies for the Spanish woman. The paramilitary group was getting more and more organized. Success in different combat zones increased his fame. Contact with ultras and hooligans from Russian football clubs led to more recruitment for the war.
Mahmud was one of his next prizes. Stopping points.
One of the first records of the Spaniard in Mahmud comes from a reconnaissance mission in August 2023. In the early days of moving toward the vicinity of Mahmud, the troops of the paramilitary group demonstrated operational efficiency by neutralizing two mortar teams. They destroyed a mobile electronic warfare system and eliminated a specialized group of drone operators from the Ukrainian forces. By this point, much had changed in the war. Mahmud had fallen months earlier, but the battles in the region were still intense. The Russians intended to advance to Chazyvyar to the west. The Spaniard worked partly in reconnaissance. Among the leaders of this process was Alexei Grishanov, codenamed Scribe. He was 38 years old when he was commanding the drone platoon in 2023. His drones detected the Ukrainian advance. They let the enemies get close enough.
The artillery had already been alerted at the right moment. They made the shells fly.
Explosions inflicted heavy casualties on the Kiev squad. The Spanish woman's drones operated non-stop near Mahmud, especially in the direction of the railway leading to the city. Surveillance detected the Ukrainians moving day and night. The artillery adjustment from the spy lenses in the skies over Mahmud made life hell for the soldiers of Kiev. They had to run between the explosions. Panic and the smell of gunpowder clung to the Ukrainians, who were harassed by Russian artillery throughout the night. The transports tried to help them. The vehicle was quickly intercepted by bombs. With one less hope for escape, the soldiers had to take shelter again in holes until the storm of fire stopped. The drones marked the railway area well. The flights of Espanola quickly passed the information to the Russian troops. This made the fan soldiers excited. At that point, the battalion was very organized. They had become a private military company earlier in the year. Now, at the end of 2023, the Spanish unit acted as a specialized reconnaissance force, bringing together several essential elements for tactical operations. Scouts, snipers, field medics, communication specialists, assault troops, drone operators, and electronic warfare teams. Strategically organized, the Spanish unit was divided into three distinct groups. The first group was made up of veterans with extensive combat experience, many of them from the renowned reconnaissance company, Skull and Bones, who formed the operational core of the unit. The second group consisted of fighters without prior experience, who served as a reserve force and were constantly training to become operational. Finally, the unit maintained a wing dedicated to logistical support, including the supply of resources and the raising of funds necessary to keep operations running. This structure allowed Espanola to operate efficiently both in reconnaissance and combat missions, as well as in the humanitarian logistics aspect. ensuring its autonomy and operational capability in various conflict scenarios. When a new enemy appeared near Bakhmut, Espanola's cannons filled with saliva, the jaws prepared to bite into the new targets. The infantry transport was greeted with heavy artillery and drones. The soldiers tried to go out and fight, but the bears' heavy fire broke their formation. The artillery kept pounding the ground. The wounded had to be evacuated quickly. The transport withdrew as explosions erupted. There were important people in the Spanish unit waiting for this kind of combat near Bakhmut. One of them was Pavel Alexandrovich Apolkov, codenamed Joker, a native of Kursk. He was the deputy commander of the sniper platoon. The shooters in the group were well trained. Their focus was to get close enough to the Ukrainian defenses to get the perfect aim. Even though modern rifles could make shots from hundreds of meters away, it was still a dangerous task. Pavel was on the front line, at risk of being targeted by drones or artillery while he was in position. Another important figure in the region was Vyacheslav Sybotin, the head of intelligence for Espanola. He was particularly happy when he learned that the Ukrainians had sent the 3rd Assault Brigade to fight near Bakhmut. This was one of the interior troops, the former Azov Battalion, now incorporated into the Ukrainian armed forces. He had promised to collect the ears of those soldiers to take home. The troops of the 3rd Brigade landed near the trenches. Russian artillery and Espanola's kamikaze drones were on them as soon as they got out of the vehicle. The movement had to be quick so that neither the vehicle nor the soldiers would become an easy target. They jumped into the first holes they saw. They watched death land right in front of them in the form of fire and smoke. The hole where they hid smelled of sweat, earth, and gunpowder. The kamikazes from Espanola exploded over them again and again. The dust saturated the air. One of the soldiers risked going outside to shoot at the drones. The rifle fired its rounds until it managed to hit one of the threats. The sound of the crash came shortly after, signaled by the explosion. The 3rd Brigade was made up of assault troops. They proceeded with an attack against the Russian trenches. His men threw grenades under cover. The rifles emptied their magazines into the Russian holes. The apprehension among the Ukrainian soldiers was high, as at any moment, more drones could fall on them. The shots from the Kiev soldiers hit the Russians. The enemy hideouts filled with smoke. Each pause was a time to treat the wounded who suffered in the difficult attack. The 3rd Brigade's kamikazes fell upon the Russians. The soldiers from Moscow moved to try to protect themselves better. The observer drones analyzed the movement and relayed the message to a brave, or perhaps insane, soldier who decided to run toward the holes where the enemies were hiding by the side of the road.
Explosive, he ran away.
The fire swirled through the hideout, unleashing its energy against the bodies of the Russians. The survivors quickly left the position. One of them, probably suffering from a concussion, ran the wrong way. The same Ukrainian found a new hideout, now with a stronger explosive, which gave no one a chance to survive. The rubble from the houses served as cover during the advances around the railway and the roads. The Ukrainians passed close to the holes and threw grenades under the cover of their comrades. After the explosion, the machine guns pointed inside, taking advantage of the bears who were stunned or still reacting by trying to protect themselves. The march continued after each hole was blown up. There were more ahead. The bears hid among the rubble, a destroyed village. The care to look for cover came before any thought of moving forward. After finding a safe spot, it was possible to aim at the enemy positions. Sometimes it was necessary to wait until a surrounded or more desperate group finally made a move. Some of them came into the Ukrainian sight. The fastest ones were lucky enough to escape the gunfire, but the second to last one faced the bullets sticking in his back. The last one suffered when 3 shots hit his flesh. He tried to duck, but the iron stingers found his blood. The artillery and drones interrupted the work of the 3rd Brigade, forcing them to retreat. A column of Russia's 83rd Marine Brigade, supported by Espanola, advanced against one of the areas under the responsibility of Ukraine's 3rd Assault Brigade. There were at least 3 T-90 M tanks, one of Russia's prides. Spanola's men supported with reconnaissance. Alexei Grishanov was there. With his drone platoon, he managed to break through the enemy's electronic warfare systems under heavy artillery fire. In this way, Grishanov determined the location of the opposing forces. But the Ukrainians were well prepared. Their drones were descending on the T-90s and the infantry transports. After the explosion started, the tanks were not very effective in helping during the attack. Some still tried to retreat under the intense pursuit of the kamikazes. Numerous drones from the 3rd Brigade were airborne. They broke through the armor of the Russian vehicles until they stopped the column. The Ukrainian tanks started firing at the opponents. The Russian fire fell before them. The crew kept their cool, putting their own torment aside to strike at the enemies. The attacks began to fire ammunition at the forces sent by Moscow, among them people from Espanola. The ammunition was constantly resupplied to keep the fire going. Even when explosions fell in front of the tank, his focus was on the target ahead, where the smoke and the screams coming from his attacks increased. The tank did not yield to Russian threats. Rockets fell in front of them. The drones exploded on its armor. The Russians suffered from the impacts of the Ukrainian shots. Some projectiles landed right in the middle of the formations where the soldiers tried to hide. It was a disastrous day for the Russians. 3 T-90 tanks and 2 armored combat vehicles from Moscow were destroyed. At least 40 soldiers died and another 25 were wounded. Among the dead was Alexei Grishanov, the commander of the drone platoon of Espanola. The 3rd Assault Brigade was very efficient in its mission near Bakhmut. At that time, it advanced intensely against the Russians before being moved from the region for special assault missions in other parts of the front. Espanola acknowledged the heavy casualty and the loss of the platoon commander on its social media, but contrary to the rumors, the battalion was not finished. After the fall of Bakhmut, one of Russia's main focuses was from the sniper platoon, and Vyacheslav Stibokin, chief of intelligence, were still at the front. The forces of Espanola increased in fame. The brigade's status arose with the increase in importance, the number of soldiers, and success in combat. It was named the 88th Espanola Volunteer Brigade. The name caused some suspicion, since 8 was often a code used by neo-Nazis. After all, the 8th letter of the alphabet is H, and 2 H's were used to start the greeting among the Nazis in honor of their leader, It could have been just a normal number without the paranoia of accusing everyone of being Nazis. But fighting in those days near Chazyvyar was also Mikhail Turkanov. He shamelessly showed off his tattoos with swastikas and other symbols referencing Nazism. There were even photos with another notorious neo-Nazi, Alexei Milchakov, from the Ruzik Battalion. Due to his presence on social media, he could just seem like someone seeking attention. However, his background was that of someone who plunged into war and made it part of his sustenance. As a mixed martial arts fighter and leader of Zenit's feared supporters group, Turkanov turned his reputation for brutality into a new career. Soldier and Russian propaganda icon on the battlefield, he made his mark on the bloodiest fronts in Ukraine. He was wounded in Bakhmut, the meat grinder of the war, and again in Zaporizhia. His actions earned him some of the highest decorations of the Russian military. With frequent appearances on state television and flattering profiles in the press, he helped popularize the Spaniard. The forces of the 88th Volunteer Brigade deployed artillery to operate against the Ukrainians. They supported the various regular Russian forces in their campaign against Chazyvyar with drones, snipers, and explosions. Mikhail Turkov had his motorcycle battalion operating in that direction against the Ukrainians. It grew with the Spanish woman's presence. The Russians sent more and more troops against one of their strategic targets. The artillery was very constant. The ammunition seemed infinite. Each arrival against the trenches was filmed by Espanola's drones. Reporting their success on social media, Pavel and his snipers set up their bases. The scopes searched for the Ukrainians in the trenches. They waited for a soldier to get distracted or for someone to pass by the spots where their rifles were lurking. The impact of an Orsis T5000 rifle in 12.7 caliber on a human body was devastating. Given the power and energy of ammunition designed for anti-material rifles and heavy machine guns, the 50-gram projectile transferred more than 15,000 joules of energy, creating a shockwave that tore through tissue and expanded the wound from an entry wound of 3 centimeters to more than 20 centimeters. The Russians were confident in their advances. They moved among the ruins, hastening their conquest toward Chazyvyar. The Ukrainian resistance did not make the enemy soldiers work any easier. Ukrainians knew how to repay death in kind. The 24th Mechanized Brigade worked to stop squads that were constantly advancing. They had drones operating throughout the city. Even though Russian channels practically considered Chazyvyar taken in 2024, the fact that there was no shortage of Moscow's soldiers dying by the dozens to make this information a reality. The 56th Motorized Brigade also increased Russian casualties as much as it could. Their soldiers approached the hidden Russians and left grenades next to them. Desperate, the men pressed themselves to the ground, trying to take as little of the impact as possible. The Russians took many hits. Russian victories never came easily, or the lightness they were propagating. The Spaniards also suffered losses and did not try to hide. The leader of the snipers' platoon died during these assaults against Chazyvyar. The group mourned the loss of someone so well trained, but there were still others in combat. The Spaniard was in action. His story wasn't over, not even the history of accusations of involvement with ideologies like Nazism